Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. I am looking forward to my chat today with first-time guest Julie Roginsky. We shall chat with her in just a second, but first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review, and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Julie Roginsky is a founding partner of Baro Strategies and has nearly 3 decades of public and private sector experience as an advisor on strategic communications, political strategy, and public relations, working on behalf of corporate and political clients, which include Fortune 500 companies, startups, nonprofits, and dozens of elected officials, including governors, United States senators, members of the House of Representatives, and state legislators. Earlier in her career, she served as the communications director for Senator Jon Corzine. Julie is also the co-founder of Lift Our Voices, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to transforming the American workplace by banning forced arbitration clauses and non-disclosure agreements for toxic workplace issues. The organization has been credited with helping to pass sweeping bans on NDAs across the nation, and with the passage of the federal Ending Forced Arbitration for Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act and the Speak Out Act, which have been called the strongest labor law change in the last 100 years. She's a former contributor at Fox News Channel, where she was a frequent co-host of Outnumbered and The Five. Prior to that, she was a contributor at CNBC, the financial news network. Julie, welcome into the back room.
Thanks so much for having me.
So before we get into all of the awesome campaign happenings, it was a very busy week, obviously, why don't you give us an update on Lift Our Voices, which is the nonprofit organization you co-founded with Gretchen Carlson and Diana Falzone, which works to combat NDAs and other silence mechanisms in the workplace.
Thank you so much for asking. We launched in late 2019, right before the last presidential election, and actually called upon all, and this was at the height of the Me Too movement, as you recall, called on all presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle to join us in eradicating NDAs for toxic workplace issues, because these issues are really very paramount to workers all across the country. Over a third of all American workers are bound by non-disclosure agreements, a staggering number, which I don't think people realize. 82% of us are bound by forced arbitration agreements, so that if you have something bad happen to you at work, even if it's illegal, you can't sue your employer. You have to take it to the secret chamber of arbitration. Statistically, it'll be buried, and you'll probably be let go from your job after it's all over. So we launched the organization to combat those issues, because we really think that we will only have equity in the workplace once people are able to speak about what happened to them, speak their own truths. And we did that, not purposely, but coincidentally, right before the launch of the last presidential election, and called on every presidential candidate to join us in eradicating NDAs. Joe Biden, who was, if you recall, in January of 2020, kind of an afterthought. Nobody thought he'd be the nominee, never mind that he would even be coming, in the top 2 or 3 of the candidates who might be the nominee, was the first to say yes, which we were really thrilled with. And then that began the domino effect for others to do. The DNC actually put it into their platform to get rid of both arbitration and NDAs for toxic workplace issues that year, which we were just immensely pleased about because it was something we'd been pushing. The RNC did not, but there were a few Republican candidates who joined us as well. Donald Trump, unfortunately, was not one who agreed with us. But what ended up happening is that we then went to work on the Hill after Biden became president and passed really what's known as probably the strongest labor law of at least this generation, that eradicated forced arbitration for sexual misconduct. And that's called the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act. The president signed that into law in March of 22. We immediately went to work to do the same for NDAs. So we passed the Speak Out Act, which basically called for the eradication of pre-dispute NDAs for sexual assault and sexual harassment. The president signed that in December of 22. Really in the most hyper-polarized time of at least my lifetime, probably in all of our lifetimes, to have this happen and to have both parties join to do that in a very bipartisan way, I think really gave a lot of people hope that there are some issues that Republicans and Democrats can agree on. And now we're working to do the same for age discrimination. So the next phase of this is to get rid of forced arbitration for anybody who's discriminated against because of their age. And I don't know if you know this, but according to the law, age discrimination actually begins at 40. So if you graduate college, you have about 18 good years to work before people can legally discriminate against you for being quote unquote old. Although somebody who's in her 50s, I find 40 to not be old at all. But so we're now working on that, and at the same time working on educating Americans about these issues, because most people don't even know about this until it happens to them, and then it's too late for them to actually do anything about it. Running a whole bunch of research projects through Cornell and Penn and other, Penn State, other partners to really understand the scope and the breadth of these issues in the workplace. So we are full steam ahead and just really excited about what the next 2 years are going to bring.
And you yourself have been impacted by these restrictions when you were at Fox.
I was. I actually was bound. I've never been bound by forced arbitration, mercifully, which is why you're able to hear my story. I am bound by an NDA. So when I was at Fox, I did sue Roger Ailes, the former chairman and CEO of Fox News, for sexual harassment and discrimination, and also the network was able to sue Fox News for that as well. But unfortunately, I can't tell you much more about that, despite the fact that movies have been made about my story and countless articles have been written, because I have an NDA as a result of my settlement. And I think Gretchen Carlson and I talk about this all the time. If we knew then what we know now, we never would have agreed to sign these NDAs because you really don't own your own story. You just don't have your own voice. And so it's very surreal to have everybody on earth be able to tell you what they think is your version of your story, but you can't tell them whether they're right or wrong. And it's very surreal to watch, a Hollywood movie being made about your story and not being able to tell anybody whether the person portraying you did it accurately or inaccurately, or it's a very weird thing to be the only person in the world not to be able to own.
Talk about your own story, right? That's crazy.
Your own story, right? Yeah. But actually, my NDA journey is not necessarily because of Fox. I actually signed 2 NDAs in my life. The Fox one was as a result of settlement, and I think some people might say, okay, well, you got something for it, so what are you complaining about? And I don't agree with that, but nevertheless, that's one line of thought. The real reason I got involved in this fight was because I've been a political consultant for a very long time. And one of my clients, a man whom I helped elect, the governor of New Jersey is the current governor of New Jersey. His name is Phil Murphy. And when I first went to work for him, I signed a standard contract, and buried in that contract somewhere deep down was a confidentiality provision, which I thought restricted me from discussing things that you shouldn't discuss, like polling and research and, campaign strategy, things that, of course, I never would discuss anyway, but I understand why there's a confidentiality need for that. In fact, it turned out to be so broad that I couldn't discuss. I think the line was like nothing at any time in perpetuity, basically till the day I die, if not after death as well. Anything to do with any work that I did for him. So including a moment when a young woman approached me about a year or so after I left the campaign to tell me that she'd been sexually assaulted by a senior staffer for Governor Murphy. And she had gone to all of his staff, and she had gone to basically knock down every door she could to try to talk to them about it. And nothing was done about it. And she called me, she asked me for help, and she asked me for advice, and I couldn't give it to her. Because at the same time that she was calling me, his lawyers were threatening to sue me for violating my NDA if I were to help her. And that was one of the darkest, if not the darkest, I would say, day of my professional career. Because here you have a young woman who is just sobbing, crying, asking for help. You can't tell her why you can't help her, because that would violate the NDA also. I couldn't even tell her that I had an NDA. And it was just awful. And that's really what made me resolve to change the law to make sure that nothing like that would ever happen to anybody else. And that's really the impetus for me for the Speak Out Act, because not only does it protect people who've experienced sexual harassment or assault, but it also protects witnesses to the behavior. So that somebody like me who wasn't harassed herself or assaulted herself in that case, but had witness information, viable information to help her would not be bound by an NDA. And that's really why I fought so hard for that law. And I'm just so immensely pleased that Congress passed it, that the president signed it. And so hopefully nobody will ever be in that situation again.
You know, it's really interesting what you were saying before about your own situation and how people say, hey, you took a settlement, so, you know, what are you complaining about? And that you happen to disagree with that position. I happen to agree with you on that because, you know, I spent many years in business, and business always has NDAs and confidentiality agreements. And usually, like you said, it's based on trade secrets and things like that, which can truly hurt the business were you to reveal them. It wasn't designed to be just an open-ended, you know, indiscriminate behavior kind of protection thing. And so I look at it like you took a settlement because you were wrongfully treated. You were harassed. And then in a sense, when you take a settlement, you're then silenced again, right? Like the predators or the harassers, they get protected again. And it's really not a fair ending to that kind of episode.
Well, I actually took a settlement because it cost me my career.
Right.
You know, I'm not working at Fox anymore. So to me, this wasn't to keep my mouth shut, the settlement. This was scant compensation, and I mean scant compensation for the end of a long career that I killed myself for. You know, and I can't specifically talk about myself, but hypothetically, somebody in my situation has one of several choices, right? If they're targeted by their boss, they could either acquiesce, which is awful and something that I think most women would not agree to do. They could keep their mouths shut, but then that person will continue to retaliate against them for not acquiescing. And basically their career is pretty much sidelined anyway, or they could speak up and file a lawsuit. And in that case, their career is over anyway, because they're upon settlement, you're not going to continue to work there. In fact, a lot of people have something, and I can't specifically talk about myself, but hypothetically, a lot of people have something called a no rehire provision, which is really unfair, which means that you could never apply for a job with that company again, even though you did nothing wrong. Right? You were kind of the victim here, and yet
right. That's the point.
Working there. Right. And so to me, you know, I took a settlement because I don't work in television anymore. I mean, I'm on TV here and there, but certainly not in the way that I was when I was at Fox, when I co-anchored shows and basically was up track there, which all came to a screeching halt the minute that I, was targeted. So from my perspective, that's what people don't understand. It's not like it's a quid pro quo. You keep your mouth shut, we're going to give you some money. It's actually like, well, this is the least we can do after destroying your career. And so, and look, the Julie Roginskys and, we mentioned Gretchen Carlson, the Gretchen Carlsons of the world will be fine. But think about what happens if you work at a big box store somewhere in the middle of the country where that's the employer for, 100 miles around. And this happens to you and you have a no rehire provision and you can't apply to work at that big box store again. Where do you work? And what do you do? And you have an NDA, so you can't tell anybody why you left. So that if your next employer asks, or a prospective employer asks, why did you leave the place where you worked before? You can't tell them. You have to either make up some story that's not true, which is not a good way to start a new relationship with an employer, or you have to just say, I can't tell you. Well, if somebody tells you, I've hired people myself. If somebody comes to me and says, I can't tell you why I left, you automatically assume the worst. You're not going to hire them. So, these issues truly, they affect everybody, but statistically, they actually affect women more than men, Black women more than anybody else, and then people making $13 or less an hour more than anybody else. So think about who you're talking about. People who are disadvantaged in every aspect of their lives to begin with, because they're women of color who are poor. And then on top of that, they can't sue because they're bound by forced arbitration clauses, and they can't speak because they're bound by NDAs.
Right.
Why even bother? Why even bother speaking up?
I used to think about that all the time when the Me Too movement first came on the scene. And you had all these very prominent people who were abused and went public. But I always thought about the cashier at Walmart in Oklahoma, you know. And even if she didn't sign an NDA, the pressure, if she's a single mom, like what does she do in those situations? She's got to work. She's got to feed her kids, you know. It's two different worlds. Like you said, there's, you know, it's the victims are women and there's black women. But then, you know, I think where really there's such a huge distinction is on a socioeconomic level, you know, where people just don't have any options, any way out. And I think about that all the time.
You know, I do too. And I'll tell you, Gretchen Carlson came forward, I want to say, in July of 2016. So it was about 18 months before Harvey Weinstein's story broke, or all the Weinstein cases broke. I came forward in April of 17, so about 6 months before the Weinstein stuff broke. Gretchen's story was on the front page of the Times. Mine was as well. Then the Weinstein story happened, and that became a tsunami, right? And you had people like Gwyneth Paltrow coming forward, and another kind of very prominent, famous people. But then you speak to some of the Weinstein survivors, and they're not Gwyneth Paltrow. I mean, you know, they're not continuing to work. These were young, and I mean young, like 22, 23-year-old assistants whose lives were ruined, and who literally, one of them is British. She left the country for years, if not over a decade, and I think went to South America to basically train horses or do something. This is Zelda Perkins, who's one of his assistants, because she just, like, everything was over for her. And this is how she spent her 20s. When you're supposed to be building up your career, she just was so traumatized by this. I don't really want to speak for her because she's very eloquent in speaking for herself. But I mean, that's the person who you can be thinking about. These very young women and men. As you mentioned, the Walmart cashier, you know, the person working at a fast food restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the epitome of this is the home health aide, the people who clean up our bedpans from our, you know, from our grandfathers and our grandmothers. And they make minimum wage. A lot of them are immigrants, so they're not particularly acclimated to our legal system to begin with in this country because they're newly arrived. A lawyer is not going to take your case, especially if you have a forced arbitration clause in it, because lawyers work typically on contingency.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're making minimum wage, they know the recovery is not going to be worth it. And by the way, if you go to forced arbitration, 9 times out of 10, if not 98, actually times out of 98% out of 100, you're not going to get anything, because that's the way the arbitration system is set up. It's set up to benefit the employer. That's just statistics. That's not my opinion. So what's the point of speaking up? But then what do, right? Either you keep your mouth shut if you're at work, and continue to get harassed and abused and discriminated against and all of these awful things that are happening to you, or you quit. But as you mentioned, you might be a single mom and you might be the sole provider in your family and you've got to eat. And so and then psychologically, the toll of not being able to tell anybody about it because you're afraid of being oblivion by somebody is really awful. I mean, that's the issue that nobody focuses on, but what this psychologically does to you when you cannot talk to anybody. You know, I ride the New York City subway every day, and you have these signs that say, see something, say something, you know, that we're kind of conditioned after 9/11. If you see something, say something. Here, specifically being told, if you see something, you're not allowed to say something.
Yeah, especially if you live in a small town. A small town living, which is, you know, where everything is revolved around a church or, you know, that kind of situation where the pressure, the communal pressure is just so enormous. You not only get impacted work-wise, but you can be ostracized from your own community. And you're right. You know, you see those signs on the subway, and as a Manhattanite, or if you live in a big city, you're like, oh yeah, great, say something. There's options. People will listen. And we sometimes forget that you live in a small town somewhere in the middle of nowhere. You don't have those places to go to. The people in power may not want to listen to you.
Or you're taking on somebody who is, you know, the local mayor or the local, you know, civic leader or the big employer in town. And people are worried that if you take that person down, you're going to be taking their jobs down with them. You're right. It's just
Mm.
it's awful, and to me, it's kind of interesting that those of us who were on TV or a little bit more high profile got the publicity, whereas the people who really should be getting the publicity on this are the people who need it most, are not us, but the people you just talked about. I
Yeah.
mean,
Well,
they really,
this is a good segue into the next subject because you also are a political consultant and you are a PR pro, and there's a lot going on, especially now with a woman on top of the ticket, which is really exciting. How much do you think women's issues, women's rights, reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, these are all things that have been important for the last couple of years or so since Roe was overturned. But how much do you think this year in particular, now with Harris as the nominee, will impact the election?
I think obviously very much so, both in a positive sense, and also you see the old misogyny riling its head that you haven't seen since the Hillary days at this level. I mean, you have somebody like Kamala Harris, who I guess is the childless cat lady who J.D. Vance was alluding to, right? Um, but about to potentially break the final glass ceiling, which is on the one hand fantastic. On the other hand, I cannot believe we're still at a time and place where people are critical of women who choose not to have children, or maybe can't have children. Um, I feel like in some ways it's very weird. It's kind of like one step forward, two steps back. I just talked about these laws that we passed, which were really the only laws to come out of the federal laws to come out of the Me Too movement. And you'd think were huge advances for women. And they're passing literally at the same time that these abortion bans are going into place in places like Alabama and Florida, and Texas and so on. And it's a weird dichotomy. It's kind of a whiplash that you're sitting here on the one hand celebrating these advances for women, on the other hand looking at horror at what we're talking about. I mean, we're now at a point where we're potentially exploring banning IVF, or that's at least a topic of discussion. I mean, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, this was something that was in kind of the fever dreams of the far, far, far right wing that no politician running for federal office would ever contemplate talking about. And yet we're literally here at a time where we're deciding whether people who are desperate to have children should be able to have children because of IVF. Look, I had my son through IVF. I would not be a mother today, which is the best thing I've ever done in my life. And I'm sure any parent would agree, the most important thing they will ever do in their life, if it weren't for IVF. And he was desperately wanted. On the one hand, you have people who are considering themselves to be so pro-family, so pro-children, so pro, having as many children as possible. On the other hand, they're saying, well, no, but only if you're physically capable of doing it the way that we want you to do it.
Mm-hmm. These are policies and bans that are driven by people who literally are telling its constituency that Democrats abort babies after they're born. Like it pops out of the woman, then they take it over to a table and do something with it, which is tantamount to murder. And how many people believe this stuff? So they're driven by such fanatical religious ideology and zealotry and obsession.
But if you're the party of what I can't wrap my mind around is you're the party, you're the pro-life party, which, by the way, if you believe that a child, that life begins at conception, I intellectually completely understand why you feel it's incumbent on you to stop abortion. I don't, I get it. But what I don't get, and what I have such a hard time understanding, is if you believe that life is precious, then when women are bleeding out to the point where they're going into toxic septic shock, and they themselves are on the verge of death, best case scenario under these situations is they may not be able to have children again because they're just, physically just so harmed. And yet you still are telling doctors to send them home. That's the part that I can't wrap my mind around, because it doesn't compute, right? Like, if you're pro-life, be pro-life. But it also means that
that's just the thing. They're not pro-life. Just like they're not pro-law and order, they're not pro-cop, they're not pro-national security anymore, they're not pro-faith, they're not pro-anything that they used to be or claimed to be. That's where we are today, and that's probably more symbolic of Trump and Trumpism in particular, although abortion and pro-life and all that stuff has been around for decades and decades. But today's Republican Party isn't pro-anything the way they used to be.
I'm not sure that Trump got them there, or whether Trump is just the manifestation of what's been for a long time. And I'll give you an example. I got to Fox first in 2004, right in the middle of the Bush-Kerry election, which was a very different Republican Party than certainly Donald Trump is, George Bush. And, I was there on and off until I left in 2017, right about 6 months into Trump's first term, or hopefully only term. And what I found interesting was the through line of all the grievances from people that I met there who are, vote Republican, was not necessarily ideology. It was sticking it to the libs, right? And that was really the mantra, that if Democrats said A, you would automatically say B. Mm-hmm. Even if you agreed with A 5 minutes earlier, you would disagree going forward. And I found that to be very, very, very interesting, because it's not really a governing philosophy, but it is a grievance-filled philosophy. And I think Trump just encapsulated that. But I think it well predates Trump, because this is even before Trump got into his birther nonsense with Obama. I mean, this really is going back to when Trump was, I think just starting The Apprentice. He wasn't really anybody on anybody's radar screen at the time politically. And so to me, that's what's so fascinating about this, is it's just grievance-based. And it's based on the fact that they feel looked down upon, and they feel disrespected, and they feel like the rest of us are living some, exotic life where we sit around, at our parlor, in our parlors, or whatever words they want to put.
Liberal parlors.
Place we sit around, right? Our
with
liberal
our cats.
Parlors. Yeah, it's sitting making fun of them because they didn't go to the Harvard-Yale game, last fall. Like, I don't, there's this very vivid imagination of what the lives of liberals are in some of these quarters. And to me, it's fascinating. I mean, look, I'm a New York City liberal. I mean, I've lived in the New York City area most of my life. I can tell you that my life is very similar, probably, to anybody's life who is on the other side of the aisle, right? I get up in the morning, I yell at my kid to get dressed, or he's going to be late to school. And I sit around worrying about him all day, and I sit around, worrying about the same issues that they sit around worrying about, right? Maybe they're a little different, but we're all still kind of worrying about the same stuff, about our families, about the future, about and nobody's looking down at anybody, because I think everybody's kind of too tired and too self-absorbed to look down on anybody. But yet I don't understand this mentality, this grievance-based mentality. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we just don't live next to each other anymore. And we don't talk to each other anymore. One of the things that I liked so much about being at Fox was that, I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which is a very liberal, people who don't know the city, a very kind of liberal enclave. I work in Democratic politics. If I hadn't been at Fox all those years, I don't think I ever would have met a Trump voter. Mm-hmm. But it was helpful to know them and to understand them. And by the way, to be friends with them. I mean, these are people we fight on air, and then we go out for drinks afterwards. And by the way, we talk, once we got off the air, we talk about the same things I just talked about. How are your kids doing? Well, my kids are doing this. Your kids are doing that. Are you worried about this? Are you worried about that? Same exact issues. But I think there's this weird imagination that both sides of the aisle have about how the other side lives. And I think if people were around each other more, and maybe we didn't have this segmented media and the segmented social media, especially culture, where people just gravitate towards what they want to hear rather than what maybe they need to hear, things would be a little different.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with a lot of that. Where I differ is that I think the Republican Party has jumped a shark in a way that we've never experienced before, and perhaps women's issues is a little different than some of the other issues because we never saw the Republican Party cozy up to fascists. They fought fascists. We've never seen the Republican Party, and I'm making a broad generalization, but we've never seen them call for the defunding of the FBI. Like, it was always liberals who had to prove that they were strong and concerned about the military and national defense and cops. And it just seems like things have been turned on their head. And that I attribute to Trump. Not that those people didn't exist before, but he was very smart in understanding that a good chunk of this country could be sucked into a cult. I mean, he said 9, 10 years ago, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose support. And I think about that all the time, not because it's crazy for someone running for president to even joke about killing someone. I mean, that alone demonstrated that on some level he's kind of a sociopath. But he knew that no matter what he was going to do, he wouldn't lose his support because he recognized how to put these people in a cult. And so I always wonder, like, what made them so ripe for that? And I always come back to one thing: racism. That's it. What makes you throw out all your values? What makes you not care about your own self-interests? What makes you not care about anything but this guy who now tells you your racism, your hatred is legitimate?
Yeah, I've thought about that too, and I keep coming back to this anecdote that I heard many, many, many years ago, and I don't even know if it's true, but I heard it or read it somewhere. F. Scott Fitzgerald was a Midwesterner, obviously a very famous writer, who was Catholic, and he came east to go to Princeton at a time when Princeton was, and still is, I think, one of the most conservative of the Ivies. And there was a tremendous amount of anti-Catholic bigotry at Princeton. It was obviously a very waspy place to go. And he was incredibly maligned as a Catholic at Princeton, really felt, whether it's true or not, felt very discriminated against, very put down upon. And I think his time at Princeton was very mixed, if not awful, as a result of that. So what did F. Scott Fitzgerald do at Princeton? Found the 1 or 2 Jewish kids at Princeton and was really awful to them. And I've always thought about that in the sense of what you're talking about, which is if I feel maligned and I feel put down upon, I'm going to find somebody even lower in the totem pole to kick, to make myself feel better, right? So, if I feel like I'm being maligned by these liberal elites that we just talked about, and I feel like I'm being looked down upon, and I feel like I'm being discriminated against, and the jobs are gone, and everybody's gone, what am I going to do? I'm going to look down upon the immigrant who's coming here for a better life. I'm going to look down upon the Black family that wants to move into my neighborhood because they want a better life, because it makes me feel better about myself. I'm going to do to them what I think these liberal elites are doing to me. And I don't know if it's racism so much as it is, I mean, obviously it is racism, but I don't know if the impetus for that is stark racism so much as it is just a sense of, I don't feel good about my place in society, so I'm going to make sure somebody is worse off than me. Rather, a rising tide lifts all boats. It's the opposite, right? I'm going to make, it's this constant grievance. It's this constant grievance of making sure that rather than my doing better, I'm going to make sure that somebody does worse to make myself feel better about myself. And, Trump is very good at that because, for those of us who lived in the New York City media market in the 1980s, I mean, remember who he was. He was the striver who never was able to break into the real estate elites that he desperately wanted to break into. I mean, we all know who really runs the real estate market in New York, and it was never Trump. It was never even close to being Trump. So what did he do? He decided to become a tabloid fixture, much more known for his social life than for any of his professional accomplishments, and yet has this massive chip on his shoulder because of that. So because he never felt good about his place in society, he has to constantly put everybody else down to lift himself up. It's kind of like that guy. If any woman hears this, she'll know what I'm talking about. That guy you've gone on a bad first date with, who spends his entire time talking about how his ex-wife misunderstood him constantly, right? And so that's who he is. Like, he was misunderstood. Nobody understands the greatness that is Donald Trump. And nobody understands the greatness that is you, MAGA cult. These people look down on you. They don't understand how great you are.
It is kind of fascinating when you think of it in those terms, because it's all just really the opposite. What these folks believe is really just the opposite of their truth. They're in a cult. They're in a cult with someone who truly has disdain for them, doesn't appreciate them, doesn't respect them, doesn't like them, doesn't even want to hang out with them, wouldn't even want them in the lobby of his buildings. Yet they share some kind of common bond that is like we've never seen before in politics for a candidate. I mean, they're dressed from head to toe in all this crazy gear. They go out and have, boat parades and truckloads of, pickup. I mean, it is fascinating to watch, but it's also terrifying, because I think there's part of it we don't understand.
I don't think these people understand, or maybe they wouldn't care if they did understand, that Donald Trump has never met anybody like them.
Right.
Ever.
He spends his whole life trying to stay away from them. Private plane, private chauffeured limousines, mansion in the sky.
Yeah, like mansion in the sky, behind gates at his country club. Listen, we have a weekend house, and I drive down the highway past Bedminster every weekend to get to and from this house. And I'll tell you, you can't get within a mile. And not because he's president, it's just the way he constructed the Bedminster golf course. You can't get a mile with close to him if you're a regular person. Same thing with Mar-a-Lago. If you've ever driven, what is it, a $300,000 initiation fee to walk into Mar-a-Lago? Trump Tower, certainly, it's not like he's hanging out in the lobby with people at the Starbucks down there.
Yeah. No, I like to joke that his sentencing next month, he literally should be sentenced to 6 months of house arrest at a MAGA family in Oklahoma.
That's a great idea.
Right?
That's a great idea.
Then they'd see just how much he really is for them, right? And how they all get along. Who throws the other one out first?
And it's not even like it's a great idea. He actually never, even as a kid, he never lived a normal life. His dad provided for him. He went to some military school, boarding school. It's not like, he didn't get into Penn and the Merits. He never, ever has been around the people who kind of idolize him. And the only reason he's around them now, if he is at all, is when they show up to his rallies.
Yeah, but that's what I keep coming back to. It's like, under normal circumstances, his followers would never support a New York billionaire. What is it then that draws them to him and keeps them there? I think the common thread is racism. And to your point, that racism can look and sound differently. It doesn't have to be exactly the same for everyone. But if someone calls you the N-word, you're probably not going to care about why they're calling you the N-word. It sounds racist, it is racist, and you're offended. So while I agree with you that it could be, I feel that bad about myself, I got to put others down, at the end of the day, it still comes back to racism. And maybe there's some other thing, but I can't think of it. I watch these folks and I'm like, what is it that just turned them into zombies? Has to be something so powerful.
But you know what? He does have a sizable chunk of support for people of color. He does. Certainly from Latino men, some African American men. So I wouldn't say they're obviously not racist towards their own people. I think it's more about, as I said, he's saying the part out loud that they're thinking. He's sticking it to the libs. as they would call it. I keep saying like every day is Festivus at his house. It's this constant airing of grievances. And that's what he's doing. He's airing the grievances constantly on their behalf. Right. So,
and the us versus them, which is what you were saying before, that's
the us versus them, and the constant, like, they are trying to live their lives at our expense, which again, nobody is, right? Like nobody is. In fact, if you look at the tax policy in this country, it's the blue states that for the most part send money back to the red states. If anybody's living at anybody's expense, it's the other way around.
Right.
But it's this constant like insecurity of somebody's getting one over on us.
Yep.
And finally, here comes Donald Trump, who's speaking up for us. He has the power and the money and the celebrity to speak up for the little guy. We're the little guy, and he's using his celebrity and money and power for the good of us, as opposed to what he could have done. I constantly hear this, which I'm just always shocked by. You know, he could have done anything with his money, but he didn't. He decided to run for president. I'm like, are you kidding me? Do you understand the guy was literally renegotiating his NBC contract? And that's when he decided to run for president as a hedge to try to get NBC to pony up more money because he was going to be a bigger celebrity.
Yeah. And now he's doing it again. He's running again to stay out of prison. So it's never about the people. But what gets me is when they say, like, he's just one of us. He's one of us. I'm not going to.
His family is monetizing every aspect of it.
See, this gets back to what I'm saying. It's like they're blind to all of this. What's making them that blind to things that not just people like you and I who are, you know, media people, elitists, whatever, New Yorkers, but just anyone with a half a brain can look at this stuff and go, it's so obvious. Why are these folks not seeing that? What is it that's blinding them in such an unprecedented way?
But they said the same. And again, I hung out with these folks during the Obama years, so I can tell you, they said the same thing to us about Obama, right? The cult. Why are you guys all into the Obama cult? I mean, somewhere today, somebody's doing a MAGA podcast talking to their guests and saying, why don't these guys understand? Why can't they clearly see what we see, right? So,
but they're wrong. They're wrong.
Of course.
That's the difference. They're wrong.
If you're in a cult, they think we're in a cult, right? They think that we're in this Obama cult. You know, they still think Obama's pulling the strings. Obama got rid of Joe Biden. Obama put in Kamala Harris. You know, Barack Obama from his, $1 billion mansion in Hawaii or Martha's Vineyard or wherever, Obama is living these days. So of course, I mean, you and I think they're wrong. They think we're wrong. And so,
but you know what the key difference, you know what the key difference is though? And you're right. That's all true. But the key difference is that we as Democrats see with our own eyes, hear with our own ears, and we could see what's crazy out there and what's true. Whereas all the things that you're mentioning, the conspiracies, the this, the that, it's all because that's what they are told by a small handful of people, because they're not intellectually curious enough to just spend 2 minutes online to see that this stuff is crazy. I mean, I always wonder, is there going to be a day when MAGA folks wake up and go, oh my God, I was so duped? Will they ever get to that point? But that's the reason they're there today, is because they're being told all this crap and they believe it. Whereas we believe they're wrong and we're right because we are. I mean, it's just, we see it. It's obvious. We're not making shit up. We're not making anything up about Trump. We're not making anything up about the GOP. We're just talking about what's real. So what we believe, and this is my opinion, obviously, but what we believe is real. What they believe is what they're being fed. And that's a huge distinction for me.
Well, first of all, I think they would question our reality, right? So already we're not, if I say the sky is blue and you say the sky is pink, and you firmly believe the sky is pink, and I firmly believe the sky is blue, we're never going to agree on a shared reality to begin with. But what scares me about your question, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, like a lot of time. and I don't recommend thinking about it at 3 a.m. because then you don't sleep, is what does it take for this to break?
Right.
And if you think about historically what has taken for these kinds of things to break, whether it's the Confederacy or communism or, God forbid, 1930s self-fascism, it's a lot of bloodshed. It's a lot. I mean, people just don't wake up and say, okay, I'm ready to move on now.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw a preview of that, and hopefully not a prequel, on January 6th. And think about what happens if Trump loses now. I mean, they don't believe that he can lose.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't accept that Donald Trump can lose. So the only way that Donald Trump will not be president is if somebody steals the election from him. Because the reality, like the vote counting that we've all done, all our, God knows how many elections I've been involved in. You win some and you lose some. Listen, there are some elections where I've worked that I've lost that I'm devastated about. But I admit that we lost, right?
Right.
But if you don't accept the fair reality that you've lost, then we have serious problems. And so what happens if he loses? And he won't concede that because nothing's worse than being a loser. And so what are we talking about here? What does it take for this fever to break? And that's what scares me so much, because I think we're sitting here coming off a very joyous 4 days in Chicago, at the convention. A kind of, I think, renewed optimism among Democrats about what could be possible in November. A governing philosophy of what the next 4 years look like if Kamala Harris wins. And yet, what happens if somebody doesn't concede this election? And what happens to his supporters if they're told, as they have been repeatedly, that they can't lose? So does the fever break? I don't think so. I think, in fact, quite the opposite. And I hate to, be such a Debbie Downer on this, but I think this is something that we don't spend enough time thinking about. What in the world are we going to do when January 6th looks like a garden party, because these people will believe that for the second time in a row, the election was stolen from them, and that they have to take their democracy back, and that they're patriots in the same way that 1776 was an act of patriotism. I mean,
Oh, it's a frightening thought. And we have history, January 6th, to sort of serve as a backdrop and maybe a foreshadowing of what could come. But I take more of like the naive libtard approach. I think about, okay, if you look at the last 4 years and take away January 6th, just take that one day away. What do you have? You have an old man spewing nonsense about how he was wronged, how it was rigged, same shit he's been spewing, in a sense, his whole life. You have several prosecutions against him. He's already been a convicted felon, adjudicated rapist and fraud. He's being sentenced next month. There's 3 more trials that will happen, especially if she wins. And so then you say, okay, what does that mean in the big picture? Okay, it's annoying, it's frustrating, we're exhausted by him, but eventually it'll peter out at some organic level, But then you throw January 6th back into the mix. I look at that and say, okay, maybe that was just a moment in time that'll never happen again, because he was president. He was their guy in the White House saying he's going to protect them. I'll even pay for your legal expenses. I'll walk down to that Capitol with you. And he didn't do any of that. And 1,500 people were prosecuted. They're not sitting at home on Sundays anymore eating chips and watching football. And I think they know that if they do that shit again, they're on their own. But where I worry is one person who's like, I don't like what's happening right now with all this enthusiasm and excitement in the Democratic Party and messing up our plan. That's what I worry about. I'm not worried about like mass violence. I think these people aren't giving up their their cushy little lives the way they like it, you know?
I hope you're right. I hope you're right, because the converse of that is, if we take our country back and we install him as president, he will pardon us because we're patriots. And that is basically what he's telling them. I mean, that's why he's playing the January 6th, card about how they're political prisoners and they're victims, and he's going to pardon all of them in a blanket pardon. That's not him saying, I'm going to give them a blanket pardon because he actually cares about them. To me, he's saying he's going to give them a blanket pardon because he's trying to build a militia for himself.
Sure. No, if he wins, it's a totally different game.
But even if he loses, because he's going to say, take it back from me, and I install me as president, and I will pardon you.
That I think he will do for sure. But I think the other people who are listening might go, wait, our so-called friend isn't in the White House anymore. A prosecutor is, and she's not messing around, and she's going to throw our asses in jail, and we're going to go away for a long time. So. And
I hope so. I mean, I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I just think, and again,
I'm never right, by the way. I'm always wrong.
Well, then we're screwed.
I'm always wrong. I always tell people, just do the opposite of what I say, and that's where the truth is.
Model.
Yeah, that's reality.
Then we're screwed, because then if the truth is the opposite of what you said, then we're in for a civil war. But
I am full of hope.
I mean, I hope you're right. I hope you're right, because it's frightening and it's upsetting to me that there are good people out there who just are, as you said, they're just their anger and their insecurities, they're not joyful.
No.
Right? They're not. I mean,
and where their fever breaks, I think, which is the real ultimate question, I think it's just when he goes on to that Mar-a-Lago in the sky, old age, whatever, like that's, because I think his people were never political. They weren't political people. And they became political because politics went from being about policy and boring shit to the Jerry Springer show. That's why he fills his rallies, which are not as full anymore, by the way. But I think when he's gone, whenever that is, and I always think he'll probably live to be 100, but when he's gone, that's when I think there's no show anymore. There's no reason for these people to have an interest in something they never really cared about before. And they'll just go back to their lives and their grievances, and not be as prominent as they are now. And I think that's when not only the fever breaks, but I think the Jeff Duncan Republican Party, Adam Kinzinger Party, starts to kind of get reborn a little. And then we can go back to hating each other over taxes and regulation and that kind of stuff.
I hope so, because we need them. I mean, we really do need a healthy second party in this country, right? It can't just be the Democrats and then a cult of personality. I mean, there really needs to be an intellectual counterweight on both sides. I hope you're right. Yeah. I really do.
Well, me too. Julie, this has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I didn't look at my notes once, which is always a good sign for me that I'm enjoying a conversation.
Really appreciate it.
And hope you come on and do it again.
Happy to. Thanks so much.
All righty. Take care.
Bye.
This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.